Rain in Seattle had been falling for 3 days straight when the woman appeared at my door. I remember thinking as I watched the water streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Eastlake condo that my life had finally arrived somewhere. I was 32. My architecture firm, which I'd built from nothing, from a drafting table in my studio apartment and a single residential client who was a friend of a friend, had just landed a contract to redesign the lobby and common spaces of a boutique hotel chain expanding up the Pacific Northwest coast. My husband, Theo, was upstairs in his home office, probably on his fourth coffee, managing the investment portfolio arm of the small wealth management firm we co-owned together. Or so I thought. We'd met in graduate school at the University of Washington. He was finishing his MBA while I was in the architecture program. He used to bring me black coffee and sit across from my studio drawings without saying anything, just watching me work. I thought that kind of quiet attention was the most romantic thing I'd ever experienced. I was 24. I didn't know yet that some people watch you carefully not because they love you, but because they're figuring out what you have that they want. We'd been married 8 years. The doorbell rang at 4:37 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I'd just set a timer on my phone to remind myself to start dinner. Our building had a concierge, so unexpected visitors didn't usually make it to the door. When I opened it, the woman standing in the hallway was leaning one hand on the wall. She was maybe 65, small and thin in a way that looked recent, like she'd lost weight she hadn't meant to lose. She had one of those quilted coats that department stores sell in November, the kind that looks warm but isn't. She was soaked from the rain. "Are you Ivy?" she asked. Her voice was controlled but very quiet. "Ivy Callahan?" "Yes," I said. "Can I help you?" She looked at me for a long moment. There was something in her expression that I couldn't read. Not pity, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that knew something. "My name is June," she said. "I don't have much time. I have lung cancer. Stage 4. My doctor told me last week that I won't see spring." She paused, and in the pause I could hear the faint effort her breathing cost her. "There's something I need to tell you before I go, something I've been carrying for 6 years and I can't die with it." I stood there in my own doorway with the Seattle rain loud behind her, and felt something cold pass through me that had nothing to do with the weather. I stepped back and let her in. She sat at the edge of my dining room chair, the way people sit when they don't feel entitled to be comfortable somewhere. She refused water. She refused tea. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table for a moment before looking at me, and when she did, her eyes were very clear and very sad. "I have a daughter," she said. "Her name is Paige. She's 34. I waited. "Paige has been involved with a man for 6 years. A married man." She said the last 2 words with a particular flatness, the kind that comes from having held a feeling so long it burns out into ash. He told her from the beginning that he was unhappy, that his marriage was already over in everything but name, that as soon as the timing was right, he would leave. She looked at her hands. "He said that for 6 years?" "That's very sad," I said carefully. My voice sounded strange to me, like it was coming from behind glass. "But why are you telling me?" She reached into the pocket of her quilted coat and placed a photograph on my dining room table. It was Theo. He was at a picnic table somewhere, maybe a park. He was wearing the green Patagonia jacket I'd given him for our anniversary 2 years ago. He was laughing at something off camera, fully, genuinely laughing in a way I recognized but could not remember seeing recently. Beside him, a woman with dark hair was leaning her shoulder into his, and between them on the bench was a little boy, maybe 4 years old, holding a juice box with both hands and grinning. I didn't say anything. "His name is Miles," June said. "He's 4. Paige has been raising him mostly alone. Theo comes when he can, on his work trips. The weekends he says he's golfing with clients." She folded her hands again. "I've been the one watching Miles when Paige works. I've been the one at the park, the one at the pediatrician. I've cooked dinner for your husband more times than I can count." Her voice faltered slightly. I kept telling myself it wasn't my secret to tell, that Paige would end it eventually, that Theo would make a decision. She looked at me directly. He never was going to, was he? It was not a question. The timer on my phone went off. Dinner reminder. I reached over and turned it off. I want you to know, June said, that I'm not doing this to protect myself or to feel better before I die. I'm doing it because Miles is going to need someone to tell him the truth someday. And because Paige, she stopped. Her jaw tightened. My daughter has wasted 6 years. I kept quiet because she asked me to, but I can't watch her waste the rest of her life on something that was never going to be what she thought it was. She reached back into her pocket and set a second item on the table. It was a folded piece of paper. This is her address, and this is mine. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just needed you to know. She stood up slowly, like standing to planning. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. I could tell she meant it. I walked her to the door. After she left, I stood in my own apartment and listened to the rain and to the total silence of the room above me, where my husband was supposedly working. I didn't go upstairs. I sat at the dining room table and looked at the photograph for a long time. And then, I picked up the folded piece of paper. I want to explain something about what happened next, because I think people assume that when you get news like this, you fall apart. You scream, or you throw things, or you cry until you can't breathe. Maybe some people do. I've thought about why I didn't, and the closest I can get to an answer is that some part of me, buried somewhere I'd never looked directly at, already knew. Not knew, but some accumulation of unanswered questions had been building in a part of my mind I'd kept locked. The sudden overnight trips for conferences that seemed to multiply once Miles would have been born. The way Theo had slowly removed himself from the financial operations of our farm over the last few years, claiming he wanted to focus on the investment side. The separate banking app I'd noticed on his phone once when he handed it to me to look up a restaurant. He'd said it was a client account he managed. Our wealth management firm was small, 8 employees, Theo and me, as equal partners. I had founded the architecture side. Theo had suggested, 2 years into our marriage, that we expand into investment advising, and I had trusted him completely with that side of the business. I signed things he put in front of me. I knew the broad strokes. I did not know the details. That night I waited until I heard Theo come downstairs, open the refrigerator, and go back up before I went to my home office. I closed the door. I sat at my desk and opened the shared accounting software we used for the firm. I started with the expense accounts. It took me 2 hours. By the time I finished, my coffee was cold and my hands were steadier than I felt they had any right to be. There were consulting fees paid to an LLC I didn't recognize, Meridian Advisory Group, going back 4.5 years. Small at first, $2,000 here, $3,500 there, then bigger, recurring. The memo line said things like client development costs and research retainer and market analysis support. I Googled Meridian Advisory Group. It was registered in Delaware as a single-member LLC, formed 4.5 years ago. I could not find who owned it. I copied everything I'd found onto a USB drive, closed the software, and put the drive in the inside pocket of my winter coat. Then I went to bed and lay next to my husband of 8 years and stared at the ceiling until somewhere around 3 in the morning. The next day, I called my CPA. Dennis had been doing our personal and business taxes for 6 years. He was 60, meticulous, and had known my father. He was the kind of man who wore the same style of reading glasses for 20 years and alphabetized his client files. I trusted him the way I trusted things that don't change. I told him I needed to meet in person, that it was urgent and that I needed him not to mention it to Theo. There was a pause. "Come in this afternoon," he said. I sat across from Dennis in his office on Capitol Hill while he reviewed what I'd pulled from the accounting software, plus 3 years of the firm's tax returns I'd brought from my own records. He went quiet for a long time. He took off his glasses twice and put them back on. His assistant knocked on the door, and he told her to hold his calls. Finally, he set down his glasses and looked at me. "Ivy," he said. "The payments to this Meridian entity, I've been flagging these to Theo for 2 years as something I needed more documentation on. He kept telling me it was a passive consulting arrangement with a former client. He said he'd get me the paperwork." Dennis's voice was careful. He never did. "How much?" I asked. Dennis looked at his screen. "Over the life of the payments. Accounting for what I can find in these returns and what you've pulled, we're looking at approximately $340,000 moved out of the firm. Possibly more if there are accounts I'm not seeing. He looked at me steadily. This isn't a rounding error, Ivy. If these payments don't have legitimate documentation, we're talking about misappropriation of business funds, potentially tax fraud. The IRS doesn't look kindly at undocumented consulting fees of this size. I heard myself ask the next question like it came from someone else. Is there any chance he's put business liability on me? Dennis was quiet for too long. The firm's operating agreement lists you as equal managing partner, he said. Some of the expense authorizations on these transfers were signed with your name. I'd need a handwriting analyst, but I was never shown those authorizations, I said. I know, Dennis said. I believe you. He leaned forward. Which means we need to talk to a lawyer before we do anything else. I called my attorney from the parking garage. Lynn had been my business attorney since I filed my LLC paperwork for the architecture side 8 years ago. She was 53, sharp, and had a particular talent for making people feel like every crisis they brought to her office was a problem she'd already seen and already solved. I needed that feeling badly in that moment. She met me that same evening. I laid out everything: the photograph, June's visit, the Meridian payments, Dennis's concern about my forged signature, the LLC. Lynn listened without interrupting. She made notes in a yellow legal pad in handwriting I couldn't read upside down. When I finished, she set her pen down. Okay, she said. First thing tomorrow I want a forensic accountant on those books. Not Dennis, someone who specifically does financial fraud reconstruction. I have someone I use. She looked at her notes. Second, you do not confront Theo. Not yet. Not until we know what he's moved and where. Because the moment he knows you know, money can disappear very fast when someone's been planning for this. She looked up at me. Has he been planning for this? I thought about the photograph. The park. The green jacket. The 4-year-old with the juice box. Yes, I said. I think he's been planning for this for a long time. She nodded like that was exactly what she'd expected. Then we plan better, she said, and we plan faster. For 3 weeks, I went home every night and cooked dinner and asked Theo about his day and watched him lie to me without breaking eye contact. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. I had just spent 8 years calling it calmness. Lynn's forensic accountant, a quiet woman named Margaret, worked through the firm's books in a way that was almost surgical. What she found was worse than I'd expected, and exactly as bad as I'd feared. Theo had created Meridian 4.5 years ago, shortly after Miles would have been conceived. He'd been routing money through it steadily, using it to pay for a 2-bedroom apartment in the Fremont neighborhood, signed under the LLC name and a car registered to Page, and what Margaret described as a constellation of personal expenses for a second household. He had forged my signature on 6 internal expense authorizations. He had also, Margaret discovered, been quietly underreporting the firm's revenue on our joint tax filings for 3 years, apparently to reduce the paper trail of what the firm should have held. Which meant that if the IRS looked, they would look at both of us. When Margaret placed the summary in front of me, I didn't cry. I put the document in a folder, thanked her, and drove to a park near the water and sat in my car for 45 minutes looking at Puget Sound. Then I drove back to Lynn's office. We're ready, I told her. We scheduled an emergency partners meeting of the firm. I told Theo I'd received the call from our largest investment client, a real estate developer who held nearly a third of the firm's AUM, requesting an urgent review of his portfolio. I said the client's attorney would be joining. I said this could be the beginning of a significantly expanded relationship. Theo came to that conference room like a man walking toward applause. He sat down, straightened his jacket, and looked around at the people at the table. Me, Lynn, Margaret, and a financial crimes detective from the Seattle Police Department named Chen, who was there because Lynn had filed the complaint 2 days earlier. There was no client. There was no developer. There was only his wife and the people she'd assembled to end what he'd built. I slid a folder across the table. Open it, I said. He did. I watched him read. The way a person's face processes something it cannot avoid is different from every other kind of facial expression. There is a specific stillness, a particular moment where the body tries to decide whether to flee. Theo's hands went flat on the table. "Ivy," he said, "you're misinterpreting the structure of these accounts." "Meridian was a legitimate stop," I said. He stopped. "I know about Paige," I said. "I know about Miles. I know about the apartment in Fremont. I know about the car. I know about the $40,000. I paused. "And Detective Chen knows about the forged signatures." The color left his face so completely that he looked, for a moment, like someone I'd never met. He tried to speak twice before words came out. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I was working out how, Paige and I. It was never supposed to go this far. Miles wasn't planned, and then you couldn't leave," I said, "and you couldn't stop. So you just kept stealing." I looked at him until he looked away. "You stole from a company that I built. You stole from a company that I built. You forged my signature to do it. You filed fraudulent tax returns with my name on them." I let that sit for a moment. "This isn't a marriage conversation, Theo. This is a business matter." Lynn served him his dissolution of partnership agreement and the formal notice of termination as a managing partner for breach of fiduciary duty. Detective Chen explained the criminal complaint that had been filed. He asked, twice, if I was really going to do this. I didn't answer that question. It had already been answered. He was escorted from the building by the security staff we'd hired for the building's common areas, which, given that we worked in a 10-person boutique firm on the third floor of a Capitol Hill office building, meant a single guard who rode down in the elevator with him and stood outside until his car left the parking structure. It was not a dramatic exit. It was just an end. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of hard, not dramatic, just relentless. I met with the IRS with Lynn and an accountant to disclose the reporting issues and demonstrate that I had not been the source of the fraudulent filings. I met with our investment clients one by one, in person, to explain what had happened and what I was doing about it. I lost 2 clients. I kept 6. I hired a new CFO, a methodical, careful man who had spent 20 years at a regional bank and believed that financial transparency was a moral position. My employees watched me come in every day and work. I think that was the most important thing I did. Not a speech, not a town hall, just, "I'm here, the firm is here, we are going to work." Some nights I drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage for a while before going in. The condo still had Theo's things in it. I boxed them slowly, a few boxes at a time, whenever I had the energy. Our attorney handled the divorce filing. It was not contested in the way that a contested divorce is loud. Theo did not fight me publicly. He had no leverage. He was charged in federal court with tax fraud and forgery. He was convicted 8 months later. The restitution order required him to repay the firm what had been taken. Whether the money would actually materialize, Lynn was honest with me, probably not most of it, not quickly. But that wasn't, in the end, what mattered most to me. What mattered was the evening I sat in my office long after everyone else had left, and thought about Miles. A 4-year-old who had done nothing. A little boy who had been brought into a situation built on deception and would spend years feeling the shape of something he couldn't name. A father who was always partly somewhere else. I thought about June, who had come to my door in the rain and used the last real energy she had to tell me the truth. Who had spent 6 years watching her daughter live inside a lie and finally couldn't watch anymore. June died 11 weeks after she came to my door. I found out because I called the number she'd written on that folded piece of paper, her home number, to check on her, and a man answered who said he was her brother. He said she'd passed peacefully. He said in the last few days she had seemed lighter somehow, like she'd put something down. I sat with that for a long time. What I did next, I told almost nobody, not even Lynn, not at first. I contacted an education consultant who specializes in setting up scholarship endowments through private foundations. I set aside a specific amount for my personal savings, not the firm's money, my money I'd earned from projects with my own name on them, and I established a small fund. It would be administered through a legitimate foundation, dispersed as an anonymous scholarship for educational expenses. It was structured so that Miles's tuition, School supplies, enrichment programs, and eventually college costs would be covered from kindergarten through a bachelor's degree, with no strings and no attribution. The foundation's administrator would contact the school directly. Paige would never know where it came from. Dennis found out about 6 months later, when I had him review my personal accounts. He looked at the disbursement line for a long time. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He looked at me over his glasses. "Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because he is 4 years old," I said. And none of this was his. The lies were not his. The missing years of his father were not his fault. If I leave him in those circumstances without doing something I actually had the power to do, then I've used what happened to me as an excuse not to be the person I want to be. I looked at Dennis. June came to my door and told me the truth at the cost of her own comfort, her own daughter's love, her own last weeks. The least I can do with that truth is try to make something useful out of it. Dennis closed the folder. "Your father would have done the same thing," he said quietly. I didn't answer. I looked out the window at the gray Seattle skyline and thought that was probably the nicest thing anyone had said to me in a year. Paige never learned it was me. She told a mutual acquaintance once, this got back to me through a chain of people, that she thought it must have been one of Theo's former colleagues, someone who felt guilty. She was grateful but suspicious. That was fine. She didn't need to know. Theo served his sentence. He was not a man built for consequence, and it showed from what I heard from people who heard things. I didn't follow it closely. I had a firm to run. What I did follow in the quietest way I could was Miles. I didn't know him. I didn't have any contact with him or Paige, but through the Foundation's administrator, I received annual updates that were standard practice for donor records, enrollment confirmations, basic progress milestones. He started kindergarten the fall after June died. His first standardized assessments showed strong quantitative reasoning. His second-grade teacher wrote a note in his file that the Foundation's administrator passed along as part of a portfolio update. Miles is the kind of kid who has to know how everything works, always asking why. I read that and sat with it for a long time. Years later, 7 years to be exact, I was at a fundraiser for a local public school architecture initiative I've been involved with designing. It was a casual event, held in the gym of an elementary school in Fremont, that my firm had helped renovate. Children's artwork covered the walls. There were folding tables with too much pasta salad and a very enthusiastic PTA president with a wireless microphone. A woman approached me. She was maybe 36, dark-haired, tired-looking in the ordinary way of single parents everywhere. "You're Ivy Callahan," she said. "Your firm did our gym." "We did," I said. She introduced herself. First name only, Paige. I kept my face even. I am not sure how. We talked for 6 minutes about the renovation. She pointed out her son, who was across the gym with a group of kids building something out of the plastic chairs, clearly reorganizing the available architecture according to his own vision. He was 11. He had Theo's jaw and, I could see even from a distance, June's eyes. "He wants to be an engineer," Paige said. There was real pride in her voice, uncomplicated pride, and I recognized it as the kind of pride that has nothing to do with the mess that produced it. "He's obsessed with how buildings work. He came home from a field trip to one of your buildings downtown last fall and talked about load-bearing walls for a week." "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it, deeply and without reservation. We said goodbye and I walked to my car and sat in it for a while with the engine off. I didn't cry in the way people expect. I felt something closer to stillness. Like a long calculation that had been running in the background of my life had finally completed. June had come to my door in the rain. She had spent the last reserves of herself to tell the truth, knowing her daughter might never forgive her. She had handed me something terrible and something clarifying all at once. I had lost 8 years of trust, a marriage, a partnership, and a significant amount of money I'd worked hard to earn. I had also found out exactly what I was made of, which turned out to be more than I'd known, and somewhere across a gymnasium, an 11-year-old who wanted to know how building stayed standing was getting an education funded by the woman his father had wronged most. He didn't know it. He might never know it. That was not the point. The point, the one I kept coming back to, was that June had not knocked on my door out of meanness or self-interest. She had come because she could not die while the truth was still buried. She had understood something that I was only beginning to understand, that the truth, even when it costs you everything, is the only foundation that holds. I started my car and pulled out of the parking lot into the wet Seattle evening. I had a proposal due Monday, a residential client with a difficult site and a beautiful view. I had been thinking about the windows all week, how to make the glass work with the light. I drove home through the rain, thinking about the windows. I've thought a lot about what causes a life to crack open the way mine did. Not the dramatic version, not the screaming or the throwing things, but the quiet kind of cracking, where something you built with your own hands turns out to have a hollow place inside it you never knew was there. Theo didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy everything. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who want a cleaner story. It happened in increments, a small lie here, a boundary crossed there, a decision to keep something hidden because the cost of honesty felt too high in that particular moment. And then another moment. And then 6 years of moments, stacked up like unpaid debt until the weight of it collapsed everything underneath. That's how it works, not with one catastrophic choice, but with 100 small ones that each felt survivable on their own. What June did was the opposite of that. She came to my door knowing it would cost her the one relationship she had left with her daughter. She was dying. She had very little energy and even less time, and she chose to spend what remained of both on the truth, not because it benefited her, not because she'd gain anything from it, but because she had reached the end of her life and looked back at the years she'd spent staying quiet and decided she couldn't add one more day to that count. I think about that choice more than I think about anything Theo did, because Theo's choices, as destructive as they were, followed a logic I can trace: self-interest, fear, avoidance. June's choice had no self-interest in it at all. It was purely, almost stubbornly, moral, and it cost her everything she had left to give. What I've learned, not from a book, not from someone else's advice, but from living inside this specific story, is that integrity isn't a feeling. It's not something you have or don't have like a talent. It's a practice, and it compounds exactly the way debt does. Every time you tell the truth when it's hard, you build something. Every time you stay quiet when you shouldn't, you erode something. Slowly, invisibly, until one day you look at your own reflection and don't fully recognize the choices that got you there. Theo eroded himself that way, and I had let myself be eroded too. Signing things without reading them, trusting without verifying, calling it love when part of it was just convenience. After everything settled, I made a decision about Miles that I've never regretted. He is not responsible for any of this. He is a child who wanted to know how buildings stay standing. That impulse, to understand how things are held together, what makes something structurally sound, what fails and why, felt like the most hopeful thing I'd encountered in years. I wanted that curiosity to have room to grow. Intelligence without integrity is just a more efficient way to cause harm. Resilience without honesty is just survival, and survival alone is not enough. I wanted Miles to have all three: the smarts, the backbone, and the moral foundation. Not because I'm generous by nature, but because June gave me something real when she had nothing left to give, and the only thing I could think to do with it was pass it forward. If you're in the middle of something that feels too heavy to carry and too complicated to put down, I hope you remember that the truth, however much it costs, is the only thing that actually holds.